The alarm screamed through the federal building lobby like an accusation. "Step aside," the security supervisor barked, his voice cutting across the marble atrium loud enough for every government employee in line to hear. "You, the homeless one, step aside now." The old man moved slowly, carefully, the way a person moves when they have learned that sudden gestures invite violence. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful, a flannel shirt gone gray from washing in gas station sinks. Work pants held up by a length of rope, because the belt had been traded for a meal 3 winters ago. His beard was matted, streaked with white, and his eyes held the particular stillness of someone who had stopped expecting kindness long ago. What the security supervisor did not know, what no one in that lobby full of bureaucrats and contractors and lobbyists could possibly know, was that in exactly 8 minutes his career would be over. The supervisor's name was Gerald Tate, and he wore his authority like a man who had never earned anything through hardship. 15 years behind a checkpoint desk had taught him to recognize opportunity when it walked through his metal detector. A vagrant triggering the alarm during the morning rush, in full view of dozens of witnesses, that was the kind of incident that got noticed by the right people. That was the kind of incident that led to promotions. "You got metal on you," Tate announced, loud enough to ensure the growing crowd could hear every word. "Weapons? Contraband? Where are you hiding under those rags?" The old man's voice came out soft, hoarse from disuse, but steady. "Sir, I have shrapnel in my left hip, from military service. It triggers metal detectors. I should have mentioned it before walking through. I apologize for the confusion." Tate's eyes narrowed. He studied the weathered face, the calloused hands, the posture that seemed somehow wrong for a homeless vagrant. The man stood too straight, his shoulders squared automatically when addressed, a reflex that decades of hardship had failed to erase. "Military service," Tate repeated, letting the words drip with theatrical disbelief. He turned to his subordinates, 3 younger officers who had gathered to watch the show. "You hear that, boys? This gentleman claims military service." The laughter that rippled through the security station was exactly what Tate wanted. A woman in a business suit looked away uncomfortably. A young man in a Pentagon lanyard pretended to check his phone. But no one intervened. No one ever did. If you're watching this story from anywhere around the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories about hidden heroes and the quiet strength of those who serve speak to you, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible stories that honor the one society has forgotten. Now, let us continue. The old man reached slowly into the worn leather satchel hanging at his side. His movements were precise, economical, the kind of efficiency that comes from years of operating in environments where wasted motion could cost lives. He produced a card, laminated plastic gone soft at the edges from years of handling, and extended it toward Tate. "My military identification," he said quietly. "It should explain the shrapnel." Tate snatched the card with more force than necessary. He studied the faded photograph, a young soldier staring back with eyes that had not yet learned what those eyes would eventually see. The name was partially obscured by scratches. The service dates were barely legible. But what Tate focused on was the face in that photograph, compared to the face standing before him. The young soldier had been clean-shaven, sharp-featured, powerful. The man before him was a ruin. Tate's smile spread slowly across his face, the smile of a predator who has cornered something weak. He turned the ID toward his subordinates, holding it up like evidence in a trial. "Take a look at this, boys. We have got ourselves a situation here." The younger officers crowded around, and their laughter built as they compared the photograph to the homeless man standing motionless before them. "That is supposed to be you," Tate said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "That photograph right there. You expect me to believe that sharp young soldier turned into this?" He gestured at Elias with undisguised contempt, taking in the rope belt, the fraying collar, the boots held together with duct tape and stubbornness. "Sir," the old man said, "time changes all of us. That photograph was taken 34 years ago. I understand it may be difficult to reconcile. difficult to reconcile. Tate laughed, shaking his head. He addressed the crowd now, performing for them, ensuring witnesses. Ladies and gentlemen, we appear to have a stolen valor situation on our hands. This man is carrying false military identification. That is a federal offense. A murmur rippled through the gathered onlookers. Some pulled out phones. Others simply watched, the way people watch accidents, unable to look away but unwilling to help. The old man's hands remained still at his sides. His breathing stayed even. Only someone who knew what to look for would have noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the almost imperceptible shift in his stance, the way his weight settled into the balls of his feet without conscious thought. These were the reflexes of a man who had spent 3 decades preparing for violence. But Elias Cormack had not survived 32 years in special operations by giving in to reflex. He had survived by knowing when to wait. So he waited, and Gerald Tate, drunk on his own petty authority, reached for his radio to summon federal police, completely unaware that he was calling witnesses to his own destruction. The radio crackled in Tate's hand as he called for federal police, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had caught something important. Suspected stolen valor case at main security checkpoint. Requesting immediate response. Subject is non-compliant and carrying falsified military documentation. Elias heard the words from somewhere far away, the way a man hears sounds underwater. His fingers had found the leather satchel at his side, touching it the way a believer touches a rosary. Inside that worn bag, pressed between the pages of a small astronomy book, was a photograph of a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. Helen. His Helen. The woman who had pressed that book into his hands 40 years ago, before his first deployment, and told him to always find his way home by the stars. She had been dead for 8 years now. Some nights, standing in soup kitchen lines or huddled under highway overpasses, Elias still reached for her in his sleep. The cancer had taken her slowly, piece by piece, the way a river carves through stone. He had held her hand through every treatment, every false hope, every devastating scan. When she finally slipped away on a Tuesday morning in October, something in Elias had slipped away with her. The house they had shared for 23 years became a museum of grief, every room haunted by her absence. He had tried to honor her memory by helping others. Helen had always believed in service, in giving back, in the idea that those who had been blessed with strength had an obligation to lift up those who were struggling. So when a veteran's charity had approached him, promising to help homeless servicemen find housing and employment, Elias had written them a check for everything he had. His pension, his savings, the money from selling the house where Helen had died. $347,000, given in good faith to men who turn out to be criminals. By the time the fraud was exposed, the money was gone. The charity directors had vanished to countries without extradition treaties. And Elias Cormack, Command Sergeant Major, United States Army Special Operations Command, architect of extraction protocols still used by JSOC, had found himself standing in a VA office being told that his benefits paperwork had been lost for the 3rd time. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of shelters and soup kitchens. 2 years of sleeping under bridges when the shelters were full. 2 years of watching people look through him like he was made of glass, their eyes sliding past as if homelessness was contagious and proximity might infect them. He had come to this federal building today to appeal his VA denial one more time. To submit paperwork he had painstakingly reconstructed from memory and old records scrounged from stored facilities. To try, one more time, to convince a bureaucracy that he existed, that his service had been real, that he deserved the help he had spent 32 years earning. Instead, he was being accused of stolen valor by a man who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The lobby had grown more crowded now. Government employees on their way to offices had stopped to watch the spectacle. Contractors with badges dangling from lanyards stood in small clusters, some recording on their phones, others simply staring with the vacant curiosity of people who had learned to observe suffering without feeling it. Tate was enjoying himself. That much was clear from the way he paced, from the theatrical gestures he made with the faded military ID still clutched in his hand. He had an audience now, and he intended to give them a show. "You know what I think," Tate announced, turning to address the crowd as much as his subordinates. "I think this individual found these documents in a dumpster somewhere. Maybe bought them at a flea market. Decided he could use a dead soldier's identity to scam his way into benefits he never earned." Elias said nothing. His eyes had found a point on the far wall, a framed photograph of the president, and he fixed his gaze there with the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had learned to retreat inside himself when the external world became unbearable. But his hand still rested on the satchel. Inside, beneath the astronomy book with Helen's inscription, beneath the photograph of her smiling in their garden the summer before the diagnosis, there were other items. Challenge coins from operations that remained classified. A DD-214 discharge form that documented 32 years of service, 3 combat deployments, and awards that most soldiers only read about in history books. And dog tags. 2 sets, worn smooth by decades of hanging against his chest. One set bore his own name. Ilyas G. Komak. O positive. Catholic. The other set bore the name of a 24-year-old sergeant from Indiana who had died in his arms in a Mogadishu alley in 1993, blood pumping from a severed femoral artery, whispering the name of a wife who would never see him again. Thomas Wakefield had been the finest soldier Elias had ever trained. Quick and smart and brave in the particular way that young men are brave before they learn what death actually looks like. He had taken the shrapnel that was meant for Elias, had thrown himself into the path of an RPG blast because his reflexes were faster than his fear. 90 seconds. That was how long it had taken Thomas Wakefield to bleed out. 90 seconds of Elias pressing his hands against a wound that could not be stopped, feeling the life drain out of a young man who deserved to grow old. Elias had carried those dog tags for 29 years. He had promised Thomas, in those final gurgling seconds, that he would never forget, that he would carry the weight of that sacrifice every day for the rest of his life. And now Gerald Tate was demanding that he prove his service was real. The federal police arrived, 2 officers with hands resting on their belts, faces professionally neutral. Tate met them with the eagerness of a dog presenting a retrieved bird. "Suspected impersonation case," Tate explained, gesturing toward Elias, carrying what appears to be falsified military identification. "I have detained him pending your investigation." One of the officers, a woman with short gray hair and tired eyes, studied Elias for a long moment. Something in her expression flickered, some recognition of the bearing that Tate had failed to see, but it passed quickly. "Sir," she said to Elias, "can you verify your identity?" Before Elias could respond, Tate stepped forward, holding up the worn ID card like a trophy. "Look at this photograph compared to him," Tate insisted. "It is obviously not the same person. This is clearly a case of stolen documentation." In the crowd, an older man in a charcoal suit had stopped walking. His eyes were fixed on the scene with an intensity that went beyond casual curiosity. There was something about the homeless man's posture, something about the precise stillness of his hands, that had triggered a memory buried beneath decades of briefings and operations and classified reports. Colonel Nathan Vestry, United States Army retired, now civilian consultant to the Pentagon, felt his pulse begin to quicken, because he had seen that posture before, in photographs, in training videos, in the halls of buildings where legends were made. And if his suspicion was correct, then the security supervisor currently mocking this homeless veteran had just made the worst mistake of his career. Tate was not finished. The arrival of federal police had only amplified his confidence, adding legitimacy to his theater. He turned back to Elias with the expression of a prosecutor approaching a hostile witness, certain of victory. "Empty the bag," Tate commanded. "Right here, right now. Let us see what else you have been carrying around with your fake credentials." The female officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we can conduct any search in a private area if the gentleman prefers." "No," Tate interrupted, his voice rising for the benefit of the crowd. "This individual chose to enter a federal building with falsified documents. He does not get privacy. He gets transparency. Empty it. Elias looked at the officer, then at Tate, then at the growing crowd of onlookers. His hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the satchel strap. "These items are personal," he said quietly. "They have significant meaning to me. I would prefer to show them in a less public setting." Tate laughed, a sharp bark that echoed off the marble walls. Significant meaning. He turned to his subordinates, shaking his head in mock disbelief. The con artist wants privacy for his props. He stepped closer to Elias, close enough that his breath was visible in the air-conditioned chill. "You do not get to make requests. You get to comply, or you get to be arrested for obstruction. Your choice." The lobby had become a courtroom, and Tate had appointed himself judge and jury. Phones were raised throughout the crowd now, recording the confrontation from multiple angles. A woman in a red blazer whispered to her colleague. A security guard from a different checkpoint had wandered over to watch. And in the back, Colonel Vestry had moved closer, his eyes never leaving the homeless man at the center of the spectacle. Elias drew a slow breath. Then, with movements that were careful and deliberate, he opened the worn leather satchel. The first item he removed was the astronomy book. Small, battered, its cover held together with tape that had yellowed with age. He set it on the security counter with the gentleness of a man handling sacred scripture. Tate snatched it up immediately, flipping it open with careless fingers. He found the inscription on the first page and read it aloud in a mocking falsetto. "Find your way home by the stars. Love always, Helen." He looked up at the crowd with theatrical incredulity. How touching. Did Helen know you were going to use her little gift as part of your scam? Something shifted in Elias's face. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a flicker of something cold passing behind the stillness. But he said nothing. Tate tossed the book back onto the counter and gestured impatiently. "Keep going. What else you got in there?" The photograph came next. A woman in a garden, summer light catching the silver in her hair, her smile carrying the particular warmth of someone who had learned to find joy in small moments. Elias placed it beside the book with the same careful reverence. Tate picked it up, studied it, shrugged. Probably pulled this from a picture frame at Goodwill. What else? The challenge coins came out one by one. Heavy discs of bronze and silver, each bearing unit insignias and operation codes. Elias arranged them in a row on the counter, his fingers lingering on each one as if saying goodbye to old friends. Tate examined them with the eye of someone who had no idea what he was looking at. "Surplus store junk," he announced. "You could buy these online for $20 each. I have seen better fakes at comic conventions." In the crowd, Colonel Vestry had gone very still. His eyes were fixed on the challenge coins, specifically on one bearing an insignia that he recognized instantly. It was the coin of a unit that did not officially exist, awarded only to operators who had completed missions that would never appear in any public record. Vestry had one just like it in a shadow box on his office wall. His mouth had gone dry. Tate reached into the satchel himself now, impatient with the pace of the revelation. He pulled out a folded document and opened it with a dramatic flourish. The DD-214. Discharge papers. This ought to be good. He scanned the document, his lips moving slightly as he read. Then he laughed again, louder this time, and held it up for his subordinates to see. According to this fairy tale, our friend here was a command sergeant major. 32 years of service. 3 combat deployments. He squinted at the decorations listed. Distinguished Service Cross. Silver Star with oak leaf clusters. Purple Heart. He lowered the paper and stared at Elias with exaggerated disbelief. "You expect anyone to believe that the man standing in front of me, in rope belt and duct tape boots, is one of the most decorated soldiers in American history?" The laughter from the security station was loud and cruel. Even some members of the crowd chuckled uncomfortably, caught between sympathy and skepticism. But Colonel Vestry was no longer watching Tate. He was watching Elias. Specifically, he was watching the way Elias's hands remained perfectly still at his sides despite the provocation. The way his breathing stayed controlled and even. The way his weight was balanced, centered, ready. These were not the mannerisms of a con artist. These were the mannerisms of a man who had spent decades training his body to remain calm in situations far more dangerous than public humiliation. Tate reached into the satchel one final time and withdrew the dog tags. 2 sets, hanging from a single chain, the metal worn smooth from years of contact with skin. He held them up, letting them dangle and catch the fluorescent light. "And here we go," Tate announced. "The crown jewels of the collection." He peered at the stamped letters on the first tag. "Ilyas Zhikomak." He looked at the homeless man. "That is supposed to be you, I assume." "It is me," Elias said quietly. Tate ignored him, turning to the second set of tags. "And who is Thomas Wakefield? Another identity you have been using? Another dead soldier whose memory you decided to exploit?" Elias's stillness cracked. It was just for a moment, just a flash of something raw and wounded passing across his features. But it was enough. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Thomas Wakefield was my friend. He died saving my life. I have carried his tags for 29 years because I promised him I would never forget." Tate rolled his eyes. Very moving. He tossed the dog tags onto the counter with a clatter that made Elias flinch. "Unfortunately for your story, carrying a dead soldier's identification is actually another federal offense." He turned to the federal officers with a satisfied smile. "I think we have more than enough here for a full investigation." But Colonel Vestry had already pulled out his phone. His hands were trembling slightly as he dialed a number from memory, a number that connected directly to an office in the Pentagon where questions about classified operations were answered. Because he had just seen something that Tate had missed entirely. When Elias flinched at the sound of the dog tags hitting the counter, his sleeve had ridden up his forearm. And there, faded but unmistakable against weathered skin, was a tattoo. Coordinates, a date, and beneath them, a single word that made Colonel Vestry's blood run cold. Whiplash. The smell of diesel and burning rubber filled his nostrils without warning. For a moment, Elias was not standing in a federal building lobby in Washington. He was back in that alley in Mogadishu, the African sun hammering down like a physical weight, the sounds of gunfire echoing off mud brick walls. October 3rd, 1993. The day the world learned what American special operators were capable of. The day Elias learned what it cost to bring everyone home. The extraction had gone wrong from the first moment. Intelligence had been faulty. The target compound was 3 times as defended as briefings suggested. By the time the team reached the rally point, they were taking fire from 4 directions and running low on ammunition. Elias had been the senior enlisted man on the ground. 29 years old, already a veteran of operations in Panama and the Gulf, already carrying the weight of men who had not come back. When a lieutenant took a round through the shoulder and could no longer command, Elias had stepped into the gap without hesitation. 11 men. That was how many he had to get out of that alley. 11 Americans surrounded by a city that wanted them dead. Thomas Wakefield had been the youngest. 24 years old, barely 2 years out of basic training, but already showing the instincts that separated good soldiers from great ones. He had a wife back in Indiana, a girl named Sarah he had married 3 weeks before deployment. He kept her photograph in his helmet band, and Elias had caught him looking at it during quiet moments, his young face soft with a love that had not yet learned about loss. The RPG had come from a window they had cleared twice. Elias saw the flash, saw the smoke trail, knew with terrible certainty that he could not move fast enough to avoid it. But Thomas could. The young sergeant had thrown himself into the blast path without thinking, his body absorbing the shrapnel that would have torn Elias apart. The explosion had knocked them both to the ground, and when Elias had crawled to Thomas through the dust and debris, he had found his friend lying in a spreading pool of crimson. The shrapnel had severed the femoral artery. There was nothing anyone could have done. Elias had pressed his hands against the wound anyway, feeling the hot pulse of blood between his fingers, watching the light fade from eyes that had been bright with life just seconds before. "Tell Sarah," Thomas had whispered, his voice already going thin and distant. "Tell her I was thinking about her. Tell her I love her. I will," Elias had promised. "I swear to God I will." Thomas had smiled then, a strange, peaceful expression for a man bleeding out in an African alley. "Not your fault," he had said. Never your fault. You get the others home, Sergeant Major. That is an order. And then he was gone. 90 seconds. That was all it had taken. 90 seconds to transform a living, breathing young man into a memory that Elias would carry for the rest of his life. He had gotten the others home, all 10 of them. He had carried 2 wounded men on his shoulders through 800 meters of hostile territory, had held a position for 6 hours until air support could extract them, had taken a shrapnel in his hip that still set off metal detectors 30 years later. The Distinguished Service Cross had arrived 3 months after. The Silver Star 2 years after that, for a different operation in a different country that officially never happened. The medal sat in shadow boxes now, probably in some storage unit whose rental he could no longer afford, gathering dust alongside commendations signed by 4 different presidents. None of it mattered. None of it brought Thomas back. The smell of diesel faded. The Mogadishu sun retreated. Elias blinked and found himself back in the federal building lobby, surrounded by strangers with phones, facing a man who had just tossed his best friend's dog tags onto a counter like they were worthless scrap metal. Tate was still talking. He had not stopped talking, had not noticed the way Elias had retreated into memory for those few seconds. His voice droned on about procedures and investigations and the serious consequences for impersonating military personnel. But something had changed in the crowd. A young woman near the front had lowered her phone. She was staring at Elias with an expression that had shifted from curiosity to something else, something that looked almost like recognition. Not his face, but of something in his bearing. The way combat veterans sometimes recognized each other across crowded rooms. Some invisible signal passing between those who had seen the elephant. Near the back, Colonel Vestry had finished his phone call. His face had gone pale, and his hand was trembling slightly as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Whatever he had heard on the other end of that line had confirmed his suspicions. And standing apart from the crowd, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and kind eyes had stopped walking toward the elevator bank. Her name was Margaret Shunn, and she ran an advocacy program for homeless veterans, a small nonprofit that operated outside the bureaucratic nightmare of the VA system. She had seen the scene before, too many times. Proud men reduced to begging. Service dismissed by people who had never sacrificed anything. But there was something different about this one. Something in the way he held himself, even now, even with his most precious possessions scattered across a security counter for public mockery. He stood like a man who had commanded others in the worst moments imaginable. He stood like someone who had earned a right to stand. Tate snapped his fingers in front of Elias's face, jerking him fully back to the present. "Hey, you listening to me? I asked you a question." Elias focused on the security supervisor with eyes that had seen things Tate could not imagine. "I apologize," he said quietly. "My mind wandered. What was the question?" Tate's face reddened with irritation at being ignored. "I asked where you really got these items. Who did you steal them from? What dead veteran's identity are you desecrating?" The word hit Elias like a physical blow. Desecrating. He thought of Thomas Wakefield's young face. He thought of Sarah, the widow he had visited every year on the anniversary until his own life had fallen apart. He thought of the promise he had made in that blood-soaked alley. "I have never desecrated anything," Elias said, and for the first time there was iron beneath the quiet of his voice. "Every item on that counter was earned through service and sacrifice. Every name I carry with honor." Tate leaned in close, his breath hot against Elias's face. "Prove it." From the back of the crowd, Colonel Vestry began pushing his way forward. His phone call had confirmed what the tattoo suggested. Whiplash One. The call sign was still classified, still spoken with reverence in briefing rooms where the nation's most sensitive operations were planned. And the man who had earned that call sign was standing in a federal building lobby, being accused of stolen valor by someone who had no idea what valor actually cost. Vestry's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, sharp with authority born from decades of command. "Let go of that man." Every head in the lobby turned toward the voice. Colonel Vestry stood at the edge of the crowd, his charcoal suit immaculate, his posture carrying the unmistakable bearing of career military. The Pentagon credentials hanging from his lanyard caught the light as he stepped forward. Tate's expression shifted from surprise to irritation. He released Elias's arm, but did not step back. "Excuse me, sir, but this is a security matter. I'm going to have to ask you to remain behind the perimeter." Vestry ignored him completely. His eyes were locked on Elias, studying the weathered face with an intensity that bordered on reverence. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the faded tattoo that had first caught his attention, close enough to read the coordinates inked into skin that had seen decades of sun and hardship. "Those coordinates," Vestry said quietly. 2.0469 degrees north, 45.3182 degrees east. Elias met his gaze, but said nothing. Vestry continued, his voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hands. October 3rd, 1993. Mogadishu. The extraction of 11 American personnel from a collapsing position in the Bakara Market District. Tate stepped between them, his face flushed with the particular anger of a man whose authority is being challenged. "Sir, I do not know who you think you are, but this individual is being detained on suspicion of carrying falsified military documents. Whatever game you two are playing, it ends now." Vestry finally looked at Tate. The contempt in his expression was surgical, precise, the kind of dismissal that only comes from true authority in countering false. "My name is Colonel Nathan Vestry, United States Army, retired. I am currently a civilian consultant to the Joint Special Operations Command at the Pentagon." He paused, letting each word land. "And I just got off the phone with people who have access to files that you do not have clearance to know exist." The lobby had gone silent. Even the ambient noise of the building seemed to have faded, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Tate's confidence flickered, but he recovered quickly. "With respect, Colonel, retired military credentials do not give you authority over federal security operations. This man triggered our alarms, could not provide verifiable identification, and is carrying items that suggest identity theft. I am following protocol." Vestry's jaw tightened. He turned back to Elias, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle in a way that seemed at odds with his commanding presence. "Sir, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Elias nodded slowly. "The tattoo on your forearm, below the coordinates. There's a word there." Vestry swallowed hard. "What does it say?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Tate craned his neck, trying to see the tattoo he had apparently missed in his eagerness to humiliate. The federal officers exchanged uncertain glances. In the crowd, phones were raised, recording every moment. Elias was silent for a long moment. His hand moved to his forearm, fingers brushing the faded ink through the thin fabric of his sleeve. He had not spoken that word aloud in years, had not needed to. The men who knew it were either dead or scattered to the winds of retirement and memory. "Whiplash," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but it carried. The words seemed to change the temperature of the room. Vestry closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were bright with emotion. "And your call sign within that program?" Elias straightened. It was subtle, an almost imperceptible shift, but suddenly the homeless man was gone. In his place stood something else entirely. Someone else. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold clarity of a battlefield commander. "Whiplash One." The effect on Colonel Vestry was immediate. His hand came up in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. The movement was automatic, instinctive, the response of a career soldier confronting a legend he had only read about in classified briefings. Tate stared at them both, his mouth working soundlessly. What the hell is whiplash? What is happening right now? Vestry held the salute for a long moment before lowering his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with barely controlled emotion. Whiplash was a special operations program that ran from 1987 to 2004. It developed extraction and hostage rescue protocols that are still in use by every Tier 1 unit in the United States military. He turned to face Tate directly. The protocols that have saved an estimated 700 American lives over the past 3 decades. Tate's face had gone pale. That does not prove anything. Anyone could claim to be part of some classified program. That is the whole point of classification, right? No one can verify it. Vestry smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Actually, that is where you are wrong. He pulled out his phone and held it up. I just spoke with the deputy director of JSOC. He's pulling the file right now. But I do not need to wait for the file, because I have spent 20 years studying the extraction protocols that this man designed. I have taught them at the War College. I have a photograph of the Mogadishu operation on my office wall. He stepped closer to Tate, close enough that the security supervisor had to resist the urge to step back. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that the man you have been publicly humiliating for the past 20 minutes is Command Sergeant Major Elias Cormack, one of the most decorated special operations soldiers in American history. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the mechanical hum of the building seemed to pause. Margaret Shun had moved to the front of the crowd now, her eyes fixed on Elias with a mixture of sorrow and recognition. She had advocated for hundreds of homeless veterans over the years, had heard stories of service and sacrifice that would break most people's hearts. But this was different. This was something she had never encountered before. A legend, reduced to duct tape boots and rope belts, being mocked by a man who had never risked anything more than a paper cut. Tate was shaking his head, but the confidence had drained from his face. This is insane. You cannot just walk in here and make claims like this. I need verification. I need official documentation. Vestry's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and something in his expression hardened. You are about to get it, he said quietly. The Pentagon just sent a car. They will be here in 6 minutes. He looked at Elias, then back at Tate. I suggest you spend that time thinking very carefully about how you want the rest of your career to go. Tate opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked genuinely afraid. And Elias Cormack, Whiplash One, Command Sergeant Major, United States Army Special Operations Command, stood amid the scattered remnants of his possessions and waited for the truth to finish what it had started. The 6 minutes that followed were the longest of Gerald Tate's life. He stood frozen at his checkpoint, watching the crowd grow larger, watching more phones rise to capture the unfolding spectacle, watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble around him. Colonel Vestry had not moved from Elias's side. He stood like a sentinel, his presence a silent rebuke to everyone who had laughed, everyone who had looked away, everyone who had failed to see what was standing right in front of them. The federal officers had retreated to the edges of the scene, their earlier certainty replaced by obvious discomfort. The female officer with the gray hair kept glancing at Elias, then at Vestry, then at her partner, as if seeking guidance that no one could provide. Amara Okonkwo had lowered her phone, but kept it recording. She was a journalist, trained to recognize stories, and she knew she was witnessing something that would define careers and destroy others. The footage she had captured would be everywhere by nightfall. The security supervisor mocking a homeless man. The challenge coins scattered across the counter. The dog tags tossed like garbage. And then the colonel's arrival, the salute, the revelation. This was the kind of story that went viral. The kind that sparked investigations and congressional hearings and tearful public apologies. Tate seemed to sense it too. His subordinates had distanced themselves from him. Subtle repositioning that spoke volumes about loyalty in the face of consequence. They had laughed when laughing seemed safe. Now they were calculating how to escape the blast radius. Sir, one of them said quietly, maybe we should wait for the Pentagon representatives before proceeding further. Tate rounded on him with desperate fury. Before proceeding? We have not done anything wrong. We followed protocol. The man triggered an alarm and could not provide verifiable identification. Everything I did was by the book. But even as he spoke, his eyes kept darting to Elias, to the way the old man stood, to the stillness that now seemed less like submission and more like the coiled patience of a predator waiting for the right moment. Elias had not spoken since revealing his call sign. He stood amid his scattered possessions, the astronomy book and photograph and challenge coins still spread across the counter where Tate had thrown them. His hand rested lightly on the edge of the counter, fingers inches from Thomas Wakefield's dog tags. Colonel Vestry leaned close and spoke quietly. Sir, I want you to know that what happened here today will not go unanswered. I will personally ensure that your service record is restored and that you receive every benefit you are owed." Elias turned to look at him. His eyes were distant, focused on something far beyond the marble walls of the federal building. "I did not come here for benefits," he said softly. "I came here because I made a promise to a young man who died in my arms. I promised him I would keep trying, that I would not give up." Vestry's throat tightened. "Thomas Wakefield." Elias nodded slowly. His wife, Sarah, received his remains and a folded flag. She received a medal in a velvet box and a letter signed by the president. He paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "But she never received a husband. She never received the father of the children they planned to have. She never received the life they were supposed to build together." The words hung in the air, heavy with 3 decades of grief. "I visited her every year," Elias continued. "Every October 3rd, I would drive to Indiana and sit with her at his grave. We would talk about him, about who he was, who he might have become." He looked down at the dog tags on the counter. "She died 4 years ago. Cancer, same as my Helen. Now I visit both of them when I can. Well, I can find a way to get there." Vestry said nothing. There was nothing to say. Near the entrance, the revolving doors began to turn. 2 figures in military dress uniforms entered the lobby, their movements precise and purposeful. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path that led directly to the security checkpoint. The first was a woman in her 40s, her uniform bearing the insignia of a brigadier general. The second was a younger man, a major, carrying a leather briefcase with a seal of the Department of Defense embossed on its surface. The general's eyes swept the scene with a practiced assessment of someone accustomed to walking into tense situations. She took in the scattered items on the counter, the pale-faced security supervisor, the homeless man standing at attention, and a retired colonel positioned protectively at his side. "Colonel Vestry," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "We received your call." Vestry snapped to attention. "General Morrison, thank you for responding so quickly." General Morrison approached the counter, her gaze settling on Elias. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she extended her hand. "Command Sergeant Major Cormack," she said. "It is an honor to finally meet you." Elias took her hand, his grip firm despite the tremor of exhaustion that ran through his frame. "General," she turned to the major beside her. "The file." The major opened the briefcase and withdrew a folder marked with classification stamps that made Tate's face go even paler. General Morrison did not open it. She simply held it up for the crowd to see. "This folder contains the complete service record of Command Sergeant Major Elias James Cormack," she announced. 32 years of service to the United States of America. 3 combat deployments. 7 classified operations. Designer of extraction protocols currently in use by SEAL Team 6, Delta Force, and the 75th Ranger Regiment. She paused, letting each word land like a hammer blow. Recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star with 3 oak leaf clusters, 2 bronze stars, and the Purple Heart. The lobby was silent. Even the ambient noise of ventilation systems seemed to have stopped. General Morrison turned to face Tate directly. "And according to approximately 40 witnesses and an unknown number of cell phone recordings, you have spent the last half hour publicly accusing this man of stolen valor while mocking his service and desecrating items of profound personal significance." Tate's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The general's voice dropped to a temperature that could freeze steel. "I suggest you start thinking about how you want to spend the rest of your afternoon, because I can promise you it will not be behind that desk." Tate found his voice, though it emerged thin and desperate. "General, with all due respect, I was following standard security protocols." The man triggered the metal detector, could not provide current identification, and his appearance was inconsistent with his claimed military background. Any reasonable officer would have responded the same way. General Morrison regarded him with the expression of someone examining an insect. "Standard protocols," she repeated slowly. "Is it standard protocol to read a dying woman's inscription aloud in a mocking voice?" Is it standard protocol to throw a fallen soldier's dog tags across a counter like scrap metal? Is it standard protocol to publicly humiliate a citizen before conducting even basic verification of his claims? Tate's face had gone from pale to a sickly gray. He looked around the lobby, perhaps hoping for support, but found only faces turned away, eyes averted, the universal body language of people distancing themselves from catastrophe. "I did not know," he said weakly. "How could I have known?" General Morrison stepped closer to him. "That is precisely the point, Officer Tate. You did not know. You assumed. You saw a homeless man and decided he could not possibly be what he claimed. You saw worn clothing and a weathered face and concluded that military service was impossible." She gestured toward Elias without looking away from Tate. "This man spent 32 years protecting people like you. People who sleep safely in their beds because men like him stand ready to do violence on their behalf. And when he walked into your checkpoint, you treated him like garbage." The major who had accompanied General Morrison was photographing the items still scattered across the security counter. The astronomy book, the challenge coins, the DD-214. Each image would become part of an official record, evidence in whatever proceedings would follow. Elias watched in silence. His hand had found the dog tags again, fingers closing around the worn metal as if drawing strength from the contact. Thomas Wakefield's name pressed against his palm, a reminder of promises made and kept. General Morrison turned her attention back to Elias, and her voice softened noticeably. "Command Sergeant Major, I need to ask you some questions. Not as an interrogation, but as documentation. Whatever you are comfortable sharing." Elias nodded slowly. "Ask." "The file indicates that whiplash protocols have been directly credited with saving approximately 700 American lives over the past 3 decades. Can you confirm that you were the primary architect of those protocols?" "I worked with a team," Elias said quietly. "Nothing in special operations is accomplished alone. But you were the lead designer. The concepts, the methodology, the training frameworks. Those originated with you." Elias was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "After Mogadishu, I spent a lot of time thinking about what went wrong. Not just in our operation, but in extraction doctrine generally. We were losing too many people in the transition between hostile contact and safe extraction. The gaps in protocol were killing soldiers who should have come home." He paused, his eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of the federal building. "Thomas Wakefield died in one of those gaps. The extraction point was 600 meters from our position. 600 meters. If we had better protocols, better coordination between ground teams and air support, he might have made it. He might be alive right now, watching his grandchildren grow up." The lobby was utterly still. Even Tate had stopped trying to defend himself, caught in the gravity of the story being told. "So I built something better," Elias continued. "I took everything I learned from every failed extraction, every near miss, every man we lost in the space between contact and safety. And I built protocols that closed those gaps." General Morrison nodded slowly. "Those protocols have been refined over the years, but the core framework remains unchanged. Every Tier 1 operator in the United States military learns whiplash methodology. Your work is taught at the War College at Coronado at Fort Bragg." She paused. "It is taught as the gold standard for extraction operations." Elias said nothing. His fingers traced the letters on Thomas Wakefield's dog tags. Colonel Vestry stepped forward. "Sir, if I may." He waited for Elias's nod before continuing. "I first learned whiplash protocols in 1998 during my assignment to JSOC. At the time, the program was still classified at the highest levels. We knew there was an architect, but the identity was compartmentalized." He swallowed hard. "I spent 20 years teaching your work without knowing your name. And then today, I saw you standing in this lobby being treated like a criminal, and I recognized the bearing. The way you held yourself under fire. The precision of your movements." He shook his head slowly. "I knew before I saw the tattoo. I knew because I had studied the mind that created those protocols, and I recognized it in the man standing before me." Elias looked at Vestry for a long moment. The recognition in the colonel's eyes was genuine, unforced. It was the recognition of one warrior acknowledging another across the vast gulf of rank and years and circumstance. "You served," Elias said quietly. It was not a question. Vestry nodded. "3 deployments. Iraq and Afghanistan. I came home because of the protocols you designed. Because when things went wrong in Fallujah in 2004, my team knew exactly what to do. We knew because you had already figured it out." The weight of those words settled over the lobby like a physical presence. 700 lives. 3 decades of service. Protocols taught at every special operations training facility in the country. And the man who had created all of it was standing in duct tape boots, his most precious possessions scattered across a security counter by a man who had never sacrificed anything. General Morrison turned back to Tate. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I want you to understand something, Officer Tate. The man you've been mocking is not just a decorated veteran. He is not just a hero. He is the reason that hundreds of American families have their sons and daughters home safe. He is the reason that operators who would have died in extraction gaps are alive today, raising children, building lives." She paused. "And you threw his best friend's dog tags across a counter because you thought it would be entertaining." Tate's legs seemed to buckle slightly. He caught himself on the edge of the checkpoint desk, his knuckles white against the surface. "I am going to recommend a full investigation into your conduct," General Morrison continued. "Your employment status will be determined by that investigation. But regardless of the outcome, I want you to remember this moment." She stepped back, her voice carrying across the entire lobby. "I want you to remember what it felt like to discover that the man you dismissed as worthless had given more to this country than you could give in 1,000 lifetimes." The lobby remained frozen in the aftermath of General Morrison's words. Government employees who had been rushing to appointments stood motionless. Contractors who had been checking phones now held them slack at their sides. The entire morning routine of the federal building had ground to a halt, suspended by the weight of what was unfolding at the security checkpoint. Tate remained slumped against his desk, his earlier bravado reduced to ash. His subordinates had retreated to the far edges of the checkpoint, physically distancing themselves from the catastrophe their supervisor had created. The federal officers who had responded to his call stood uncertainly, clearly unsure whether they should stay or quietly disappear. General Morrison turned to the major beside her. "Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, please begin documenting witness statements. I want contact information from everyone who recorded the incident." "Yes, ma'am." Reeves moved into the crowd with quiet efficiency, his manner professional but not intimidating. People began offering their phones, eager to be part of whatever justice was coming. Amara Okonkwo stepped forward before Reeves could reach her. "I am a journalist with the Washington Herald," she said, holding up her press credentials. "I have continuous footage from approximately 3 minutes after the initial confrontation began. I am happy to provide a copy for official purposes." General Morrison studied her for a moment. "Your name?" "Amara Okonkwo." The general nodded slowly. "I cannot control what you publish, Ms. Okonkwo, but I would ask that you consider the dignity of Command Sergeant Major Cormack in whatever story you choose to tell. He has been through enough today." Amara glanced at Elias, still standing quietly amid the chaos he had not sought. "I understand, General." She paused. "For what it is worth, I think the story that needs to be told is not about his humiliation. It is about the systems that allowed it to happen. How a man who gave everything can end up with nothing, treated like a criminal in the country he protected." General Morrison's expression softened almost imperceptibly. That would be a story worth telling. Through the exchange, Elias had remained still. His hand rested on the counter beside the scattered remnants of his life, fingers touching the astronomy book that Helen had given him 4 decades ago. The inscription inside had faded with time, but he did not need to read it. The words were carved into his memory deeper than any tattoo. "Find your way home by the stars. Love always, Helen." He had tried. God knows he had tried. After she died, after the charity took everything, after the VA lost his paperwork for the 3rd time, he tried to find his way back to something resembling home. But home was not a place anymore. Home had been Helen's laugh in the morning, her hand in his during thunderstorms, her voice reading to him on nights when the nightmares came. Home had died in a hospice bed 8 years ago, and Elias had been wandering ever since. Colonel Vestry appeared at his side, moving quietly as if approaching a wounded animal. "Sir, the general has arranged for transportation. We would like to take you somewhere more comfortable. Get you a meal, fresh clothes, whatever you need." Elias looked at him with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by kindness or cruelty. "I came here to file an appeal," he said quietly, "for my VA benefits." The paperwork was lost again. Vestry's jaw tightened. "That will be handled. I give you my word. By the end of the day, your file will be restored and your benefits will be expedited." He paused. "But right now, I'm more concerned about you. I have survived worse than this, Colonel. I know you have." Vestry's voice was gentle. "But you should not have had to survive this. Not here. Not from people who owe their safety to men like you." Elias was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he began gathering his possessions from the counter. The astronomy book went back into the satchel first, handled with the care of something infinitely precious. Then the photograph of Helen, her summer smile preserved behind scratched plastic. The challenge coins followed, each one placed precisely in the worn leather bag. Finally, he reached for the dog tags. His fingers closed around the 2 sets of metal, and he stood motionless for several seconds, feeling the weight of them. His own name, Thomas Wakefield's name. 30 years of carrying both, of keeping a promise made in blood and fire, and the desperate final seconds of a young man's life. When he turned back to face the lobby, something had shifted in his bearing. The homeless man was gone completely now. In his place stood Command Sergeant Major Elias Cormack, Whiplash One, architect of protocols that had shaped special operations doctrine for 3 decades. He walked slowly toward Gerald Tate. The security supervisor flinched as Elias approached, pressing himself back against the checkpoint desk as if trying to disappear into it. His earlier cruelty had curdled into naked fear, the terror of a man confronting consequences he had never imagined. Elias stopped 3 feet away. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I want you to understand something, Officer Tate." His voice was quiet, measured, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I'm not angry at you. I have faced enemies who wanted to kill me, who tried to kill the men I loved, who succeeded in killing the best friend I ever had. Compared to them, you are nothing." Tate swallowed hard but could not look away from Elias's eyes. "What you did today was not evil. It was small. It was the smallness of a man who has never been tested, who has never sacrificed anything, who has never loved something enough to die for it." Elias paused, letting the words settle. "I have met thousands of men like you in my life. Men who mistake authority for power, who mistake cruelty for strength, who mistake the uniform for the service it represents." The lobby was utterly silent. "You will face consequences for what you did today," Elias continued. "I cannot control that, and I would not stop it if I could. But the worst punishment you will ever receive is not losing your job. It is knowing, for the rest of your life, that when you were given the chance to show compassion to someone who needed it, you chose contempt instead." He turned away from Tate without waiting for a response. General Morrison was watching with an expression that might have been pride. Colonel Vestry had tears tracking silently down his cheeks. And Margaret Shunn, who had witnessed the entire confrontation from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward with a look of quiet determination. "Command Sergeant Major Cormack," she said softly. "My name is Margaret Shunn. I run a program for homeless veterans outside the VA system. No paperwork, no bureaucracy. Just help for people who have earned it." Elias looked at her, and for the first time since the confrontation began, something like hope flickered in his eyes. Margaret Shunn had spent 15 years working with homeless veterans. She had seen men who had stormed beaches reduced to begging for change. She had seen women who had commanded platoons sleeping in cardboard boxes. She had learned that the distance between hero and homeless was often measured in a single moment of bad luck, a single failure of the systems that were supposed to catch those who had given everything. But she had never seen anything like this. The man standing before her had designed the protocols that kept American soldiers alive. His work was taught at the most elite military training facilities in the world, and he had been living under bridges, eating at soup kitchens, carrying his entire life in a leather satchel held together with hope and habit. "My program is small," she said quietly, her voice pitched for Elias alone despite the crowd still watching. "We do not have government funding. We do not have fancy facilities. But we have beds and we have people who understand what you have been through. No judgment. No hoops to jump through. Just help if you want it." Elias studied her face with the same careful attention he had once given to mission briefings. He had learned long ago to read people, to separate genuine offers from manipulation, kindness from agenda. What he saw in Margaret Chin's eyes was something he had not encountered in a long time. She meant it. Every word. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why do you do this?" Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and withdrew a photograph, worn at the edges, laminated against time. She held it up for Elias to see. The image showed a young man in army dress uniform, his smile bright and unguarded, the smile of someone who had not yet learned what service would cost. "My brother," Margaret said, "Sergeant First Class David Chun. 2 tours in Afghanistan. He came home with medals and nightmares and a system that did not know what to do with either." She paused, her voice steady despite the grief beneath it. "He died alone in a VA parking lot, waiting for an appointment that kept getting rescheduled. Overdose. The official report called it accidental, but I know better. He just stopped fighting." Elias looked at the photograph, at the young face frozen in a moment before everything went wrong. He understood. God, how he understood. "I started this program 6 months after we buried him," Margaret continued. "I cannot save David, but I swore I would do everything in my power to save the ones who came after." She put the photograph away. "I have helped 217 veterans find housing in the past 5 years. 63 of them have found employment. 41 have reconnected with families they thought they had lost forever." Numbers. Statistics. But Elias heard the lives behind them. 217 people who might have ended up like David Chun. Like him. "I do not need saving," he said quietly. The words were automatic, the reflex of a man who had spent 2 years refusing help because he believed he did not deserve it. Margaret nodded slowly. "I know. You have survived things that would have broken most people. You have carried weight that I cannot imagine." She paused. "But surviving is not the same as living. And you have spent long enough just surviving." The words hit Elias somewhere deep, somewhere he had walled off after Helen died, after the money disappeared, after the system failed him over and over. He had told himself that survival was enough, that getting through each day was victory enough, that he did not deserve more than that. But Margaret was right. Survival was not living. It was just not dying. General Morrison approached them, her manner respectful of the conversation she was interrupting. "Command Sergeant Major, I need to inform you of some developments." Elias turned to face her, his posture straightening automatically. "The footage of this incident has already begun circulating online," the general said. "Lieutenant Colonel Reeves has confirmed at least 12 separate recordings from witnesses. Several have been posted to social media." She paused. "By this evening, your story will be national news." Elias closed his eyes briefly. He had spent 32 years in the shadows, operating in places that did not officially exist, accomplishing missions that would never be acknowledged. The idea of public attention felt like a violation, an exposure of something that was supposed to remain hidden. "I do not want this," he said quietly. "I know." General Morrison's voice was gentle. "But it has happened, and we need to decide how to respond. The Pentagon Public Affairs Office is already fielding calls. They want to issue a statement honoring your service." Elias shook his head slowly. "I do not want honors. I do not want statements. I just want to be left alone." Colonel Vestry stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, I do not think that is possible anymore. What happened here today has exposed something that goes far beyond one security officer's cruelty. It has exposed a system that fails the people who serve it." His voice grew passionate. "Your story could change things. It could force conversations about how we treat veterans, about the gaps in our support systems, about the distance between the gratitude we claim to feel and the help we actually provide. Margaret nodded in agreement. He is right. The attention you did not want could become the catalyst for change you never imagined. How many veterans are out there right now, living under bridges, being dismissed by people like Tate? How many of them might be helped if your story forces the country to pay attention? Elias looked between them. These strangers who had appeared in his life within the span of an hour and were now asking him to become something he had never wanted to be. A symbol, a cause, a face for the faceless thousands who had served and been forgotten. He thought of Thomas Wakefield, who had died saving his life. He thought of Sarah Wakefield, who had lived for decades with the absence her husband left behind. He thought of Helen, who had told him to find his way home by the stars. He thought of all the men and women he had served with, the ones who had come home broken and found a country that did not know how to help them. The ones who had ended up like David Chun, dying alone in parking lots while the system shuffled paperwork. If his story could help even one of them, did he have the right to refuse? The lobby had grown quiet again. The crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation now waited to see what would happen next. Phones remained raised, still recording, still documenting. Elias drew a deep breath. His hand found the dog tags beneath his shirt, pressing them against his chest. "All right," he said finally. His voice was rough, reluctant, but determined. "Tell me what you need me to do." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of activity that Elias observed more than participated in. General Morrison commandeered a conference room on the 3rd floor of the federal building, transforming it into a temporary command center. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves coordinated with Pentagon Public Affairs. Colonel Vestry made phone calls to contacts accumulated over decades of service. And Margaret Chin sat quietly beside Elias, a steady presence amid the chaos. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the National Mall. From where he sat, Elias could see the Washington Monument rising against the gray January sky, a white needle pointing toward clouds heavy with the promise of snow. He had been to Washington many times during his service, but always in transit, always moving between briefings and deployments and the endless machinery of military operations. He had never simply sat and looked at the city he had spent his life defending. It was strange, he thought, how much beauty he had missed while he was busy surviving. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. Reeves entered with a tablet in his hand, his expression a mixture of amazement and concern. "Sir, the footage has gone viral." He set the tablet on the table in front of Elias. "As of 10 minutes ago, the primary video has over 2 million views. It is trending on every major platform." Elias looked at the screen. The video showed himself standing at the security checkpoint, Tate's voice clearly audible as he mocked the DD-214 and threw the dog tags. The image quality was sharp, the audio clear. Every moment of humiliation had been captured in perfect detail. But it was the comments that caught his attention. Thousands of them, scrolling faster than he could read. "This man is a hero. How dare they treat him like this? I serve with operators who trained under whiplash protocols. This man saved my life and never knew it. My grandfather was in special forces. He came home the same way, broken by war, abandoned by the system. This has to change. Crying watching this. What have we become as a country?" Elias pushed the tablet away. The outpouring of support felt overwhelming, almost suffocating. He had spent 2 years as invisible, a ghost drifting through a city that looked through him. Now millions of people were watching his worst moment, commenting on his life, forming opinions about a man they had never met. General Morrison entered the room, her phone pressed to her ear. She finished her conversation and sat down across from Elias. "The Secretary of Defense wants to speak with you personally," she said. "The White House has also reached out. They're considering a public statement from the president." Elias shook his head slowly. "That is not necessary. With respect, sir, I think it is." Morrison's voice was firm but kind. "What happened to you today is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a much larger failure. Veterans are falling through the cracks every day, being dismissed, being forgotten, being treated as problems rather than people. She leaned forward. Your visibility gives us a chance to force real change. Policy changes, funding changes, systemic reforms that could help thousands of people. I'm not a politician, Elias said quietly. I'm not an advocate. I'm just a soldier who made some protocols and lost everything. You're more than that. The voice came from Colonel Vestry, who had entered the room behind Morrison. You are proof that heroism does not protect you from the system's failures. You are proof that medals and commendations mean nothing when the paperwork gets lost. He sat down beside the general. And you're proof that the people we call heroes can end up homeless while bureaucrats shuffle papers. Margaret Chin reached over and placed her hand gently on Elias's arm. You do not have to be comfortable with this, she said softly. You do not have to enjoy it, but you can use it. Every camera pointed at you is a chance to tell the truth about what veterans face when they come home. Elias looked at the faces around him. A general who commanded respect with every word. A colonel who had taught his protocols without knowing his name. An advocate who had lost her brother to the same system that had failed him. They were asking him to be something he had never been, to stand in the light after decades in the shadows. But they were also offering him something he had not felt in years. Purpose. The door opened again, and Reeves entered with a young woman in civilian clothes. Sir, this is Dr. Amira Hassan from the VA Central Office. She has been sent to personally address your benefits case. Dr. Hassan approached the table with visible nervousness, clutching a folder to her chest. Command Sergeant Major Cormack, I want to apologize on behalf of the entire Veterans Administration. Your file was flagged for priority review 2 hours ago. She opened the folder with trembling hands. Your benefits have been fully restored. Back payments will be processed within 72 hours. And I have been authorized to offer you immediate enrollment in any VA program you choose. Elias stared at her. 2 years of fighting, of appeals, of paperwork lost and resubmitted and lost again. 2 years of sleeping under bridges while bureaucrats failed to find records of 32 years of service. And now, in the span of hours, everything had been resolved. It should not take a viral video, he said quietly. It should not take a general and a Pentagon investigation to get a veteran his benefits. Dr. Hassan swallowed hard. You are right. It should not. And I am sorry. Elias looked at the folder in her hands, at the papers that represented his service finally acknowledged. Then he looked up at the faces watching him. How many veterans are waiting right now? He asked. How many of them are fighting the same battle I was fighting this morning? How many of them will never have a general show up to validate their service? The room was silent. Elias stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting. He walked to the window and looked out at the Washington Monument, at the city built on promises of liberty and justice for all. I will do it, he said finally. I will talk to whoever needs to hear this story. I will stand in front of cameras and tell them what happened. Not for me. He turned to face the room. For the ones who are still out there. The ones sleeping under bridges tonight. The ones being told their paperwork is lost. The ones being mocked by people like Gerald Tate because they do not look like what a hero is supposed to look like. General Morrison rose to her feet. Thank you, Command Sergeant Major. Elias shook his head. Do not thank me yet. He looked at Margaret Chun. First, I want to visit your program. I want to see the work you are doing. I want to meet the veterans you have helped. He paused. And then I want to help you help more of them. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. It would be my honor. Through the window, the first snowflakes began to fall over Washington, dusting the monuments with white. And Elias Cormack, who had spent 2 years trying to disappear, began to understand that perhaps he had survived for a reason after all. The snow was falling heavily by the time they left the federal building. General Morrison had arranged a military vehicle to transport Elias to Margaret's program facility, a converted warehouse in southeast Washington that had been transformed into a refuge for veterans who had nowhere else to go. Colonel Vestry walked beside Elias as they crossed the lobby, passing the security checkpoint where everything had changed just hours before. The area was empty now, Tate and his subordinates removed pending investigation. Yellow tape cordoned off the station, and federal investigators were photographing the scene as if it were a crime site. In many ways, Elias supposed, the vehicle waiting outside was a black SUV with government plates. A young sergeant held the door open, snapping to attention as Elias approached. The salute was crisp, precise, delivered with the kind of reverence usually reserved for generals and medal ceremonies. Elias returned the salute automatically, muscle memory from 3 decades of service. "Sir," the sergeant said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father served in the Rangers. He came home different, broken in ways we could not fix. He took his own life when I was 16. The young man's eyes glistened. "I joined the Army because of him, because I wanted to understand what he went through. And when I saw the video today, when I heard what you built, what you sacrificed, I wanted you to know that men like my father, they mattered. Their service mattered, even when the world forgot them." Elias placed his hand on the sergeant's shoulder. What was his name? Staff Sergeant Michael Torres. The name came out like a prayer. Elias nodded slowly. "I will remember him." He paused. "And I'm sorry we failed him. I am sorry the system we built was not enough to catch him when he fell." The sergeant blinked rapidly, fighting tears. "Thank you, sir." The drive across the city took 30 minutes through snow-choked streets. Elias sat in silence, watching the Capitol slide past the tinted windows. Government buildings gave way to residential neighborhoods, then to the industrial areas where rent was cheap and attention was scarce. Margaret's facility occupied a former shipping warehouse, its brick exterior weathered but solid. A hand-painted sign above the entrance read Chun Veterans Center, with the image of a compass rose beneath the letters. "Find your way home." Elias stared at the sign for a long moment. The echo of Helen's inscription was unmistakable. Margaret was waiting at the entrance, sheltered from the snow by a metal awning. She led them inside, through a reception area decorated with photographs of veterans who had passed through the program. Some showed before and after images, gaunt faces transformed into healthy smiles, desperate eyes replaced by hope. 217, Margaret said, gesturing at the wall. Every face up there represents someone who found their way back, someone who was given a second chance. The main hall of the warehouse had been divided into sections. A dining area with long tables, a recreation space with couches and a television, a small library filled with donated books, and along the far wall, a row of doors leading to individual sleeping quarters. "It is not much," Margaret admitted, "but it is warm, it is safe, and no one here judges anyone for how they ended up needing help." A man emerged from one of the sleeping quarters, drawn by the sound of voices. He was perhaps 50, with a thick beard and the weathered skin of someone who had spent too many nights exposed to the elements. He froze when he saw Elias, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Holy hell," the man breathed. "You are him. The guy from the video." "Word travels fast," Margaret said with a small smile. The bearded man approached slowly, his gaze fixed on Elias with something like wonder. "I watched it 3 times. The part where you told that security prick about smallness versus evil." He shook his head. "Man, I felt that in my soul. I have met so many people like him. People who look at us and see nothing. People who decide we are worthless before we even open our mouths." "What is your name?" Elias asked. "Frank Riley. Staff Sergeant, 101st Airborne. 2 tours in Iraq." He gestured vaguely at the warehouse around them. "Been here about 3 months. Margaret pulled me out of a tent city in Anacostia." Elias extended his hand. Frank took it, gripping firmly. "What are you doing up here, Frank?" The question was simple, but Frank's expression shifted, layers of pain rising to the surface before being pushed back down. "Same story as everyone else, I guess. Came home with more demons than I could handle. Wife left. Lost the job. Lost the apartment. Spent a while pretending I could figure out on my own." He shrugged. "Turns out I could not." "No one can," Elias said quietly. "Not alone." Frank studied him for a moment. "Is it true what they are saying? That you wrote the protocols that every special ops unit uses? That you are some kind of legend?" Elias shook his head. "I'm not a legend. I'm just a man who learned some things the hard way and tried to make sure others did not have to learn them the same way." Frank laughed softly. "That is exactly what a legend would say. Other residents had begun emerging from their quarters, drawn by the commotion. Word of Elias's arrival spread through the facility like electricity through a wire. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, men and women of varying ages, all bearing the invisible wounds of service. Margaret raised her voice to address them. "Everyone, I want to introduce Command Sergeant Major Elias Cormack. Some of you may have seen the video that has been circulating today." She paused. "He has agreed to help us expand our program, to use his visibility to bring attention to the work we are doing here and to the thousands of veterans who still need help." The applause started slowly, one person clapping, then another, then the entire room. It was not the polished ovation of a ceremony or the obligatory appreciation of a formal event. It was raw, genuine, the sound of people who understood exactly what Elias had been through because they had been through it themselves. Elias stood in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by faces that mirrored his own journey. Lost and found, broken and healing, forgotten and finally seen. For the first time in 2 years, he did not feel alone. And somewhere in the crowd, a young woman with her father's eyes and her mother's determination was recording everything, preparing to tell the story of the Chun Veterans Center to a world that was finally ready to listen. 3 months later, the cherry blossoms were blooming along the tidal basin when Elias Cormack stood before a crowd of 300 people on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The event had been organized by a coalition of veterans advocacy groups, drawing attention to a new bill making its way through Congress. The legislation, informally known as the Cormack Act, proposed sweeping reforms to VA processing times and established emergency protocols for veterans in crisis. Elias had resisted the naming. He had argued that the bill should honor the countless veterans who had suffered in silence, not the one who had accidentally become famous. But the sponsors had insisted. The name recognition would help it pass, they said. The story behind it would remind legislators why it mattered. He stood at the podium in a new suit, the first he had owned in years. Margaret had helped him pick it out, insisting that he could not address Congress in flannel and duct tape boots. His beard was trimmed now, his hair cut short, his appearance transformed from the man who had triggered a metal detector in a federal building lobby on a January morning that felt like a lifetime ago. But some things had not changed. The dog tag still hung beneath his shirt, 2 sets of names pressed against his heart. The astronomy books still traveled in his satchel. Helen's inscription faded but legible, and the shrapnel still sat in his left hip, a permanent reminder of an October day in Mogadishu when a young sergeant had given everything so that his commander might live. The crowd before him was a sea of faces, some familiar, most not. Margaret stood in the front row beside Colonel Vestry, who had become a regular presence at the Chun Veterans Center. Frank Riley was there, 3 months sober and working part-time at a hardware store. Sergeant Torres had driven down from Fort Bragg on leave, determined to witness the moment in person. And in the back, held at bay by event security, a cluster of journalists waited with cameras and microphones, ready to broadcast whatever Elias might say to a nation that had not stopped paying attention since that viral video first appeared. Elias gripped the edges of the podium and began to speak. 3 months ago, I walked into a federal building to appeal a denial of benefits I had earned through 32 years of service. I was homeless. I was hungry. I was carrying everything I owned in a bag held together with hope. And I was treated like a criminal by a man who decided, based on my appearance, that I could not possibly be what I claimed. He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. What happened that day has been called many things. A viral moment, a scandal, a wake-up call. But I want to tell you what it really was. It was ordinary. It was the same thing that happens to veterans every single day in this country, in VA offices and unemployment lines and homeless shelters. The only difference is that someone happened to be recording when it happened to me. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. I did not ask to become a symbol. I did not want cameras or interviews or legislation with my name on it. I wanted what every veteran wants: to be seen, to be believed, to have my service acknowledged by the country I spent my life protecting. He shook his head slowly. That should not be extraordinary. That should be the minimum. He thought of Thomas Wakefield, who had died believing that his sacrifice would matter. He thought of Helen, who had spent their final years together watching him carry weight she could not lift. He thought of David Chun, Margaret's brother, who had died alone in a parking lot because the system could not find time to help him. The bill before Congress will not fix everything, Elias continued. No law can heal the wounds that veterans carry home from war. No policy can replace the brothers and sisters we have lost. No amount of funding can give back the years stolen by trauma and neglect. But it can make things better. It can close the gaps that swallow people whole. It can ensure that when a veteran asks for help, someone is there to provide it. He looked out at the faces before him, the veterans and advocates and ordinary citizens who had gathered to witness this moment. I spent 2 years trying to disappear. I believed that I had nothing left to offer, that my service was ancient history, that the man I had been was gone forever. He paused. I was wrong. The man I was, the soldier who built protocols to bring people home, he is still here. And he has one more mission left. Elias straightened, his posture shifting into the bearing of a command sergeant major addressing his troops. My mission now is to make sure that no veteran ever has to fight as hard as I did just to be seen. My mission is to support the people like Margaret Shun who are doing this work every day without recognition or resources. My mission is to honor the memory of every service member who came home broken and found a country that did not know how to help them. He reached beneath his shirt and pulled out the dog tags, letting them catch the spring sunlight. These tags belong to me and to a young sergeant named Thomas Wakefield who died saving my life 30 years ago. I have carried them every day since, as a reminder of what sacrifice really means. He held them up for the crowd to see. Thomas believed that his country was worth dying for. I believe that our veterans are worth fighting for. And I will keep fighting until every one of them knows that their service matters, that their struggles are seen, and that they are not alone. The applause began slowly, building like a wave until it crashed over the memorial steps. People rose to their feet, veterans saluting, civilians wiping tears, journalists capturing a moment that would lead every evening broadcast. Elias stood at the podium, letting the sound wash over him. He thought of Helen telling him to find his way home by the stars. He thought of Thomas asking him to get the others out. He thought of all the lost years, the cold nights, the moments when giving up had seemed like the only option. He had not given up, and now, finally, he understood why. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel and share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life that deserves recognition? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones in uniform. They're the ones who keep fighting long after the world has stopped watching. Thank you for being here. That night, Elias returned to the Chun Veterans Center. He walked through the main hall, past the wall of photographs that now included his own face, past the dining tables where residents gathered for meals that tasted like community, past the library where donated books offered escape and education. He stopped at the window of his small room, looking out at the city lights reflected in the Potomac. The astronomy book set open on his nightstand, Helen's inscription visible in the lamplight. Find your way home by the stars. He had wandered for so long, through wars and loss and years of invisible suffering. But standing here now, surrounded by people who understood, doing work that mattered, he realized that home was not a place you returned to. Home was something you built one day at a time, from the wreckage of everything you had lost. Still here, Helen, he whispered to the darkness. Still here, Thomas. Still trying. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias Cormack closed his eyes and slept without nightmares.